Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad has acknowledged the role of Taliban in the fight against ISIS in Afghanistan. The envoy tweeted Wednesday that effective operations by U.S. and Afghan forces, as well as the Taliban, led to ISIS losing territory and hundreds of fighters in the Nangarhar province. The tweet has drawn much derision from Afghan social media users. Khalilzad arrived the same day in Kabul as part of a renewed effort to revive talks with the Taliban. In Kabul, he met Afghan President Ashraf Ghani and other leaders and discussed steps that could lead to a ceasefire and a peace deal. Khalilzad's visit comes just days after Trump visited U.S. troops in Afghanistan for the Thanksgiving holiday, when he hinted at a resumption of peace talks with the Taliban. A State Department statement said Khalilzad will go to Doha from Kabul to resume talks with the Taliban. According to an AP report, Sohail Shaheen, the Taliban spokesman in Doha, said the agreement reached in September called for an immediate ceasefire with US and NATO troops. The agreement also called for an intra-Afghan dialogue to begin within 10 days of the signing. The first item on the agenda was to be a ceasefire. Meanwhile, during a visit to Kabul, the German defense minister said that Germany is ready to extend the NATO mission of 1,000 German troops in Afghanistan. On Wednesday, the head of a Japanese NGO, Dr. Tetsu Nakamura, and 5 others were killed in an attack in Nangarhar province. The attack was condemned by Taliban's Doha spokesman Shaheen, who took to Twitter about the attack, and I quote, "The emirate, by its policy, does not target humanitarian services that serve our people, but rather facilitates their humanitarian activities throughout the country. Strongly condemn the attack." The tweet was in Pashto. This is a rough translation of that Pashto tweet. To discuss these developments, joined by Dr. Jonathan Schroden, who is the director of CNS Center for Stability and Development, has written extensively on Afghanistan and has worked there. We also have with us Rahimullah Yusufzai, who is the resident editor of the news and joins us from Peshawar, and Hamdullah Hamdard, who is an analyst and writer based in Kabul. Let me begin with Dr. Schroden here. Dr. Schroden, I saw your tweets also. What exactly do you make of the statement given by Khalilzad with reference to essentially talking about the Taliban as a counterinsurgency, counter-terrorist force, and secondly, his meetings in Kabul?
Well, I think his tweet drew a lot of attention, as you pointed out. But I would say 2 things about it. First is, I think it's largely accurate. I mean, the Taliban have been pretty active against ISIS-K, especially in eastern Afghanistan. They've lost quite a few fighters combating that group over the last year or 2 years, especially in Nangarhar and areas around there. So I think his tweet is largely accurate in so much as the Taliban have been fighting ISIS-K pretty significantly during that time. The collapse of ISIS-K in Nangarhar in over the last month or so has been a pretty notable development and a positive one across the board for the U.S., for Afghans, but frankly also for the Taliban. I mean, the one thing that all these groups have in common is that they all despise ISIS in Afghanistan. And so, it's not too far a stretch, I think, to look at his tweet and say he's giving credit where I think some credit is actually due. The second thing I would say about it is, right, he's obviously trying to make inroads to restart the negotiations. And so, holding up a bit of a fig leaf to the Taliban here and giving them a little bit of credit for some of their operations against the common enemy of ISIS, I think was actually a fairly wise move, even though it has drawn quite a bit of controversy in Kabul itself.
Absolutely. In fact, the second point that you made is essentially referring to that, because it does seem to me that he was trying to signal to them that, you could be partners. You have, in a way, I mean, of course, the Taliban operations were not under the coordinated command of NATO or the Afghan National Security Forces, but separately. But he's kind of saying, well, you could be partnered, and I'm coming to Doha again, and we're going to talk and pick up the pieces from where we left, and we could be partners again. I think that was the point that he was trying to signal to them through this tweet.
Yeah, I think that's right. As I said, the Taliban have been active against ISIS-K for some time, as has the U.S. and Afghan security forces. Both of those groups have been, watching what each other has been doing against ISIS. And while there's been no, to my knowledge, formal coordination of those operations between the Taliban and the U.S. and Afghan security forces. I don't think it's a stretch too far to sort of think that there might have been some back channel or informal deconfliction, at least, of those operations. And that could potentially serve as a model, as a model for trying to keep pressure on groups like ISIS that are mutual enemies of virtually everyone in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Dr. Schroden. Go to Hamdullah Hamdard here. Hamdullah Hamdard, as I said, and Dr. Schroden is saying that there is some truth to the fact that the Taliban were operating against ISIS in Nangarhar. But as I said, the Khalilzad's tweet became controversial, and as I was kind of scrolling down, the responses were pretty nasty at one level. What is your take of how Khalilzad's tweet with reference to the Taliban operations in Nangarhar was generally received otherwise? I mean, apart from just the social media that I'm talking about.
I believe that Dr. Zalmay Khalilzad is trying to pave the ground for restart of the peace negotiations, which were stopped by Donald Trump with a single tweet. And he was about to meet Taliban and the Afghan president at the Camp David, but then the meeting was cancelled and the peace process was stopped. The deal was not signed. Now, once again, as the presidential elections of Afghanistan have passed and still we are looking forward to the elections results, Dr. Zalmay Khalilzad visited Kabul, and he will be going back to Qatar as well, and he met some Pakistani officials in the previous days too. He is trying to restart this process with the Taliban, and probably the agreement during the 9 rounds of his peace talks with the Taliban might be signed. And there were 2 important things in that. One was that Taliban or the Afghan government or anyone will not treat the neighboring countries, and especially the U.S. allies. They will not be targeted by the Afghan government or the Taliban, or there should not be any terrorist group in Afghanistan that will attack or that would attack their allies from Afghanistan. This was one of the promises they wanted to make, and the second was about the withdrawal of the troops. You better know that. So here, Zalmay Khalilzad is trying to pave the ground for the restart of the negotiations. That's why he's giving some credit to the Taliban, beside the Afghan government and international forces in Afghanistan who are fighting against ISK, or Islamic State of Khorasan, here in Afghanistan.
Okay. Yusufzai, this is, as we can see, there's clearly signaling going on. And the fact that, essentially, as I said, that almost to the point where the Taliban are being looked at as a partner force that was involved in counter-terrorist operations. But the interesting thing that has been reported, as I mentioned in my opening, has to do with what Suhail Shaheen said about the sort of overall thrust of the agreement that was about to be signed in September. Namely the ceasefire and also the intra-Afghan dialogue, because at that time, it was generally said that it had more to do with the withdrawal timetable, and perhaps the rest of it will come later. But now it appears that there was more to that agreement than just the withdrawal timetable. What is your information on this?
I think that the ceasefire issue has been exhaustively discussed. This was the American demand. This was also the demand of the Afghan government. Taliban were put under pressure when the talks broke down. And I think the incentive for reviving the talks to Taliban, as mentioned by the U.S., was that if you reduce the violence or if you agree to a ceasefire, then the talks can be revived and maybe it could lead to an agreement. So I think this was a temptation for Taliban, because they want to have this peace accord. They want to ensure that the foreign forces leave Afghanistan, because that has been a justification for their war, and this is what they wanted primarily. So I believe that, there could be a limited ceasefire between Taliban and the U.S.-led forces. Maybe not with the Afghan government at this stage, but subsequently it can also happen. And then, this intra-Afghan dialogue, this is ongoing. There have been meetings, as we all know, in Moscow and Qatar, and the next meeting is planned in China. So the format of the intra-Afghan dialogue is still a matter of controversy and dispute, but it will be discussed, I think, because the Afghan government would like to be represented officially at this intra-Afghan dialogue, while Taliban disagree. But I think that, once you are satisfied with what has happened and agreed, then you tend to praise the other side, as Zalmay Khalilzad has done. That, look, Taliban also are contributing to the fight against ISIS. And this is no longer a secret, because I believe Taliban have inflicted heavy casualties and damage to the ISIS, not only in Nangarhar, but also in Zabul earlier, and then also in northern Afghanistan, in Jozjan and Faryab. So that contribution has now been acknowledged by the U.S. This cannot be, kept hidden, because that is a fact. But I think that there is no formal cooperation yet between Taliban and the U.S. and the Afghan government. I think that is too early to say. So they are actually fighting the ISIS for their own purposes, separately. And, if it is a common objective, okay, that's fine. But I think they are doing it, separately.
I agree with you, Rahimullah Sahab. I think what Dr. Schroden said makes a lot of sense in terms of course, not a coordinated, command system, but some kind of back-channel deconfliction agreement. Because obviously, if you have an area in which 3 different types of forces are operating, then you would probably need something like that to avoid confusion and to be able to concentrate on an adversary. But let me go back to Dr. Schroden here. Dr. Schroden, before I let you go, and let's try and jump ahead of the curve a little. Let's assume that, this agreement is signed and there's some agreement on total or partial ceasefire, and then we enter into this intra-Afghan dialogue thing. Now, there we have the issue, and last time when you were on my program, we actually discussed it in some detail. But now we're looking at a situation that is likely to be, and that is who exactly are the Taliban going to talk to? In the sense that the election results are not out. Some kind of Afghan delegation will have to be put together. You think that's going to be easy or moderately difficult or messy? What's your sense?
I would say messy. Certainly, the lack of the election result is a major complicating factor. It would be difficult for the Taliban, I think, to sit down and negotiate with a delegation that is primarily from the current administration, not knowing whether or not that administration has won the election, will continue to be the government of Afghanistan, et cetera. So, I think the U.S. has been pushing hard for President Ghani to nominate a more inclusive negotiating team that would include members of the opposition, members of civil society, members of women's rights organizations, and have greater female representation. I think as a means of trying to get the intra-Afghan negotiations going, even in the midst of the election uncertainty. That's a pretty tall order, and certainly President Ghani has not announced such a team yet. So that's a major point of uncertainty. The other thing I would point to that's going to make this very messy is it is completely unclear to me what the negotiating platforms of the two sides actually would be if and when they would sit down together. Other than the announcement by Suhail Shaheen that a ceasefire would be the top item on the agenda, which is a good place to start and I think necessary for the people of Afghanistan. The question then becomes, what are the other items on the agenda? What is the negotiating platform of both sides in terms of major structural issues like power sharing, future election participation, what happens with the Taliban fighters and the rest of the Afghanistan security forces? how are they going to engage the international community to continue to try and keep the aid that Afghanistan's government is primarily reliant upon flowing. I mean, these are all major issues that the two sides have really said nothing about, at least publicly, in terms of what it is they would hope to accomplish or in what order they would expect to tackle.
Do you have a sense that some of the issues, obviously, the U.S. side would be alive to this? And is there a likelihood that they're probably been discussing this with the Taliban and also with the Kabul government, even as this wasn't really the cutting edge of the talks that were held that have been held over the last more than 1 year?
I mean, I'd be surprised if they haven't broached some degree of these issues in the course of those conversations. But there has been, at least as I've been able to discern, no public discussion of those talks and what they might have been, discussed. Well, but what I find really interesting is there's not even been any mention that they've discussed those types of issues at all. Which leads me to believe that if they have come up, they've come up at only a surface level of depth, and they really haven't gotten into any sort of detailed discussions of how to resolve these very, very, thorny issues that Afghans are going to have to resolve amongst themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Schroden, speaking with us. Hamdullah Hamdard, you heard Dr. Schroden. It's going to be messy. In terms of who's going to talk, who the Taliban are talking to, what will be the composition of the delegation, what exactly is the platform, what exactly are the benchmarks. So there are a number of issues. Do you think there is some discussion in Kabul, officially and otherwise, about these thorny issues?
Exactly. President Ghani is trying on the national consensus in the country. He is talking to the political parties. He is even talking to the oppositions. Once the presidential elections results are out, then after that, he can further pave the ground for the complete national consensus on the peace deal with the Taliban. And one thing Dr. Schroden said, the Afghan government is legally authorized to talk with the Taliban. The delegation that the Afghan president will be introducing to talk with the Taliban, they will be the people representing Afghanistan. The roadmap of the peace deal is already given by the Loy Jirga, or the Grand Jirga, which was held in this year, in the ongoing 1398 year. So President Ghani already has the roadmap with him. He has the voice of the people with him.
But Hamdullah Hamdard, I get what you're saying. But what if the results are announced and we find that there is a deadlock? What happens then?
Well, if the results of the elections are deadlocked, then of course the elections will have to go to the second round, and then whoever becomes the president, they still have the roadmap for peace through the Loy Jirga, which was held in Afghanistan. Okay. Either Dr. Abdullah or Dr. Ghani, whoever becomes the president, they will definitely have to make sure that there is a national consensus before talking to the Taliban. Because the 15 people delegation or the 25 people or member delegation who will be talking with the Taliban, they all should have a coordinated voice, and there should be no opposition, or they should not oppose each other during the peace negotiation with Taliban.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Thank you. That was Hamdullah Hamdard speaking with us. Before I wrap up the segment, let me just go back to Rahimullah Yusufzai. Rahimullah Saab, how do you look at these issues, these intricate and thorny issues that Schroden discussed and also I spoke to with Hamdullah Hamdard about?
I think, there is hope because this dialogue, has been ongoing. There have been hurdles. It broke down, but it is being revived. So, this is the best, time and, the opportunity to have peace finally in Afghanistan. But, it's not done until it is done. So there will be more hurdles. There will be opposition. Look, there is sort of an animosity, towards Taliban. So if Zalmay Khalilzad has praised them, he has been criticized.
Yeah, he has been
So
deeply
there will be
criticized.
elements, who will not like to.
Yes, that's going to be the spoiler. That's going to be the spoiler effect. Thank you so much, Rahimullah Yusufzai, for speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss NATO's 70th anniversary summit and whether an alliance that was put together to counter Soviet threat is now focusing on China. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. NATO leaders set aside public insults on Wednesday, declaring at a 70th anniversary summit they would stand together against a common threat from Russia and prepare for China's rise. In a statement issued after they met on the outskirts of London on Wednesday, NATO leaders said, and I quote, "We recognize that China's growing influence and international policies present both opportunities and challenges that we need to address together as an alliance. The United States is leading the charge for a greater focus on China and is confident of a receptive audience in much of Europe, where concerns are mounting about Beijing's growing economic leverage." NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg noted ahead of the alliance's summit that China was the world's second largest defense spender after the United States. And he said, and I quote, "It's not about moving NATO into the South China Sea, but it's about taking into account the fact that China is coming too close to us," pointing to Chinese activity in the Arctic, Africa, and heavy investments in European infrastructure. Meanwhile, the summit was plagued by internal dissensions and public insults. How exactly is NATO looking at China? To probe this question, we have with us Klaus Jurgens. He speaks with us from London, and also Mr. Andrew K.P.Leung, who also joins us from London. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Mr. Leung here. Mr. Leung, what do you think of this China focus as far as NATO is concerned? I mean, the report suggests that while President Trump obviously, as I said, is leading the charge, there is some, thinking within the European alliance partners that China doesn't really offer the kind of threat that the Soviet Union did when NATO was put together. What's your sense, since you were there and you had your nose to the ground?
Well, as you said, the United States is leading the charge against China because China is perceived across the aisle in the United States as Americans' greatest existential and strategic threat, because it's not only since joining WTO, China has become much more powerful, and its perception is that China is now eating Americans' lunch in top technology, but also threatening American interests in the South China Sea and various other fields. So to the United States, a pushback against China is 360 degrees. As I said, I mean, it's not only on the South China Sea, not only in trade, technology, but also ideology with Xinjiang and Hong Kong and a host of other issues. But to the European Union, the challenge is slightly different because China is not about to invade the European Union. China's interest in Europe is mainly through the Belt and Road and investments. And these kind of perceived risks have sometimes very little to do with the military. So I think NATO is a military organization.
Mr. Leung, I get your point, but since we don't have an American representative on the panel, let me try and play the role of one. As you know, one doesn't need to invade countries. In fact, Chinese strategic thought for thousands of years has been wedded to the fact, as Sun Tzu said, to win and destroy the enemy battalions is the second best. To win and preserve the enemy battalions is the excellence of war. So the Chinese investments, the Chinese sort of soft strategy is as effective in terms of projecting Chinese power as the Chinese, for instance, the Armada would do. So the sense, and then since you talked about investments, President Trump, and also, in fact, the UK and certain other countries have been talking about the Huawei 5G technology, and they say that this could be a security threat. So there is a sense that at some level they have to be wary of China's power projection.
The United States, the pushback is a result of the rivalry between two an existing hegemon or the existing superpower and its perceived challenger. But then the European Union, the same kind of perception does not really apply, because the European Union doesn't want to be a world hegemon. And of course that there is some common ground between the China and the European Union as well, insofar as the defender of a multilateral kind of system. But the United States is American first, and also pushing the unilateralism underpinning the American leadership in the world order. Now, this may not be shared by the European Union.
Absolutely. I'll return to you a couple of more questions, but let me hop over to Klaus Jurgens. Mr. Jurgens, what is your sense of the China focus during this NATO summit?
NATO is in a kind of finding itself process, and not only in the light of that France and Germany actually proposed to set up a European army, not as a kind of competitor to NATO, but somehow complementary. Europe wants to find its own defense voice. Now, Washington must make sure that within NATO, Washington, of course, has its own voice. And I think seeing that a threat from Moscow is no longer a tangible option, how to keep NATO alive, how to have a raison d'être, as the French would say, you have to find, unfortunately, new enemies. Now, is China an enemy? Not as far as I am concerned. Does it have political deficiencies? With all modesty, what about democracy? This would not be the subject here, but I don't want to see a third world war or a kind of confrontation about certain issues, including mobile technology, bring the world to the brink of another armed confrontation. And I don't see China ever wanting this. So is it playing to the gallery? It is one option. But as I've said, NATO is trying to find itself. NATO is in a kind of identity crisis. And if I may bring in very briefly the Turkey dimension, yesterday I took the journalistic liberty to suggest, why not give the Secretary General position after Mr. Stoltenberg ends the second term to a Turkish candidate, in order to bring Turkey's positive geopolitical dimension and its positive relations with Russia into play. Now, perhaps the time would be right. Would this lead to a further confrontation with China? I don't think so. But would it bring Russia closer to perhaps a few shared values with NATO members, making sure war can no longer happen, armed conflict is a thing of the past? This, I think, would be a very positive dimension, but my personal viewpoint is China is, for the time being, not a threat to world peace. Okay. Definitely not.
So for the being, that's the qualifier that you've used. But let me ask you something else. Since you're talking about NATO trying to find an enemy, let's rewind to immediately post Soviet Union period, which was also a unipole moment of sorts for the United States, and then of course the debate that went into expanding NATO and kind of bringing it closer to the Russian Federation's borders, something that found lots of proponents, but also certain opponents. And the jury is still out on that. And some people say that Moscow is reacting exactly to that. Now, what is your sense of, do you think that NATO should not do a repeat of that with what it did with the Russian Federation with reference to China?
Well, I think the The final declaration here in London, I'm now down in Brighton, but the meeting was up in Watford, of course, near Watford. Now, the final declaration, and that everyone agreed, of course, including the Turkish president, means that there could be certain reinforcements of NATO in the Baltic states. Would Moscow really want to see that? I am not so certain. But would Moscow now expect, would President Vladimir Putin expect that NATO would use these Baltic states' reinforcements in order to one day in the future attack the Soviet Federation? Of course not. Would in return Vladimir Putin say, now we have to attack European soil? Of course not. I really don't believe in this. I think everyone has learned a lesson, definitely in Berlin, definitely in Brussels, and definitely in Moscow too. There has to be peace. There has to be cooperation and understanding. So this is like a little bit of saber rattling, I think, to find this new, if I may come back to this point, you said it before, this finding a new identity for NATO. Of course, you have to find, playing to the gallery, a new enemy. You have to show strength. You have to show force. And President Trump suggested that every member state should pay now 2% of its GDP towards NATO. Now, how can you convince the electorate if there is no perceived threat? It's a very, very delicate balancing act, but may I say so, playing devil's advocate in the positive sense, I don't think that Moscow will attack European soil or America, and as I've said, I don't see that China would do that.
That's a very
anytime soon, hopefully never.
That's a very interesting thought. Thank you so much. That was Klaus Jurgens speaking with us. Let me go back to Andrew Leung. Mr. Leung, there's of course the proposition that there should be peace, and everyone talks about that. But unfortunately, throughout recorded history, we've seen war. And we've seen that there is what Mearsheimer called the tragedy of great power politics. So there is the existing hegemon, there is the rising power. Are we in that Thucydides trap that Graham Allison talked about? Are we going to see some kind of conflict, or do you think that it can be avoided?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, that this trap seems to be kind of threatening on a number of fronts, as the United States takes a 360 degrees pushback strategy against China. You mentioned Graham Allison. There are other very influential thinkers, including Spalding with his recent book, The Stealth War, and even Elizabeth Economy recently defining the China's threat. And of all, the perception is really across the aisle. Both parties, is regardless of President Trump. Even if President Trump doesn't have a second term, I'm sure that the Democrats, a Democrat president, would equally want to push back against China, as there was a perception that China's trade practices may not be fair, but also the disappointment that China will after joining the WTO, would not become more like the West. So I think that this is a kind of epical or tectonic kind of rivalry, would still remain with us for a long time. But coming back to NATO, though, and because of this American first, in fact, President Trump is in a way wants to withdraw from some of his responsibilities in NATO and asking NATO allies to pay more, but also the fear amongst other NATO members that they are now subject to another threat from Russia. And then, of course, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Russia became part of the Western orbit, but no longer so. After the annexation of Crimea, the fear is that the Russian influence could spread to certain parts in Europe. And so the concerns are real. But on the other hand, Europe doesn't want to create an enemy in Russia. And definitely, there is no point creating an enemy in China. If you look at some of the NATO members, including France, including Canada, I mean, they all want to embrace the China market in terms of technology, security, and so on and so forth. So as far as NATO is concerned, it needs to redefine its risk. and opportunities. I think that we are now in a totally new epoch as the United States want to withdraw from its commitments, and then there are new threats and new opportunities coming in Europe and in fact in the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was K.P.Leung speaking with us. Of course, this is a very tricky situation. And in fact, given the emerging technologies, the issue of stability becomes even more dicey. Having said that, this is all for tonight from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.